My clock reads 6:05, so let's go ahead and get this party started. Again, welcome, greetings. Hope you're well. My name is Tafari Melasizwe. I'm the communications coordinator for the Dignity in Schools campaign. You are at part one of a digital intensive that has been put together by the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance in concert with the Dignity in Schools campaign, called the No Data About Us Without Us piece, which is going to be a really fantastic digital intensive looking at emerging trends and relationships between technology, big data, and education, is how that all overlays in the work that we're doing. I'm not the expert on this conversation. You're going to be in two extraordinarily capable hands, and I'm going to speak quickly so you can get to those capable hands really quickly. And I just want to provide a little bit of context about who we are and what this is for people that may not be familiar. Just in short, again, this work is happening in concert as a joint kind of piece. And the Dignity in Schools campaign works to challenge the systemic problem of push out in our nation's schools and works to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. As a national coalition, the campaign builds power amongst parents, youth, organizers, advocates, educators, me, you, hopefully your family too, to transform their own communities, support alternatives to a culture of zero tolerance, punishment, criminalization, and the dismantling of public schools, and to fight racism and all forms of oppression. And again, Marika and Roxana are going to get into this much more. And I thought that it would be really appropriate as we frame this discussion and discourse to talk a little bit about a piece that I think is quite exciting in relation to technology, big data, and ideas. This comes from a professor friend of mine, Jared Ball, whose work imixwhatilike.org is really, really, really fantastic. And he talks about this piece called Our Newton's Laws and how, as he says here, like Isaac Newton once gave the name to pre-existing universal laws of motion. His three laws can be summarized as nothing changes course without force. The size of what is to be changed determines the force required to change it. And change comes to all involved in achieving it. I'm not going to read the whole thing at length, but Jared Ball talks about Huey Newton from the Black Panther Party and that there are political equivalents to those laws. And one thing that I thought was really key in that was that one of the things that Huey Newton said was that advances in technology don't improve social relations. They in fact intensify and worsen them. Advances in technology, he noted, are developed by exploiting the very workers who are then further suppressed by those advances. So I thought about this whole conversation of big data, machine learning, predictive analytics, risk assessment, so on and so forth. And as we're providing this framework and context in this table setting kind of conversation, I thought it would be interesting to kind of like look at, you know, our Newton's laws in relation to the political equivalents that are discussed therein. So we're excited that you're here. I'm going to pass it to Marika, who is going to start things off for us. And Marika, take it away. I think you might be muted, Marika. Right, Marika,
Hello,
can you?
everyone. Can you hear me now? Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Tafari. We are excited to be sharing our first evening webinar on the digital intensive, No Data About Us Without Us. And so our goal this evening is for this first set in this series is to lay some foundational groundwork about what is percolating, what is coming up across the country when it comes to emerging technological trends, and what are the impacts that it has on communities, on youth, on families, not just now, but for the next 50 years to come as these trends continue to take greater space in the decision-making realm around resources, around decisions, and around opportunities. So tonight, what we're going to do for you is provide a bit of a framework and an overview of what really is beginning to emerge and how it's showing up. And the format of this digital intensive is we want to welcome you. We want to provide you with a case study to kind of give you some context. And then we're going to give you some new information and material to help you think through that case study and help you apply it to what may be happening in your area or community. So if you will, next slide, please. I am not alone in this webinar. I am here with Dr. Roxana Marachi, and she is going to introduce herself briefly. But again, my name is Marika Pfefferkon. I'm with the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance and the Midwest Center for School Transformation, and I'm a member of the Dignity in Schools campaign. Dr. Marachi.
Think that you are muted. Dr. Roxana, go ahead and try to unmute yourself one more time.
Okay, that took some time. My apologies for that. It wasn't allowing me to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the welcome. My name is Roxana Marachi. I am the education chair of the California State NAACP, and I am a professor. I teach at San Jose State University. I teach educational psychology in the teacher credential program, and I teach courses in educational leadership for the doctoral program. I'll share a little bit more when I do my intro. I'm really honored and grateful to have been invited to share with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I am going to take myself offline so you can focus on the screen in front of you. All right. So we're going to begin the presentation with taking a moment to look at a historical context in No Data About Us Without Us. I thought it would be important to start with a bit of history on data and the benefits and harm that have always accompanied conversations around data. So what you see before you is examples of how data has been used in the past. So what I have on the screen here is an image of Ida B. Wells, who is well known for capturing the data around the lynching of Black people during Jim Crow. And the reason why I bring this up is because without her actually capturing that data and telling the story, I wouldn't actually be able to use this as a point of reference about how data can be used for good and how also data can be used for harm, and how it can benefit community. Ida B. Wells was ahead of her time and was making sure that historically there was an accurate story told. And that really is the goal of data, is to take a piece of information, capture it, and wrap it around with a story or a narrative to give you a bigger picture. I also want to reference how W.E.B. Du Bois also used big data and data as a way to tell the story about the progress of African Americans over the history in America, because other folks were not sharing the successes and the celebrations that came along with progress and policy and practices that welcomed African American people into the mainstream America through the vote and other civil rights. So here are two examples of how people have used data to tell a story that was critical. But many times in history, there are stories that data tells that don't accurately reflect us and don't have the nuance or understanding of what they're surfacing or uncovering. So when we talk about data, it's important to keep it into its context. That data cannot be neutral because the people around it that interact with it, use it, and share it are not neutral themselves. So if you will, the next slide, please. So as I said, data is not new. Tools are not new about how we've collected and shared information about each other. But what is starting to become new and is an emerging trend, and that's impacting everyone, is that at the local and national and global levels, decisions are being made by data, for data, and sometimes in that data-driven decision making, the human equation is removed and we don't have enough context to make informed decisions. And so folks are using our personal data to make decisions about us without us. I also want to just really center this conversation that we're talking about data, we're talking about big data. This is actually our new currency. It is very valuable. It is more valuable than oil. And so when you think about all the data that is being collected around us and we're giving it away for free, and other than some apps with advertising, we're not truly benefiting. So we really want to be aware of how we are benefiting others outside of our own community. But more specifically, I want to talk about how the use of data is transforming in education. So now we have districts and local governments that are being incentivized to adopt cross-system integrated data sharing platforms in response to shrinking budgets, lack of resources. Recently, a lot of resources are being invested in big data for surveillance reasons around school mass shootings. And in general, data is being used to help folks focus on improving outcomes for students. So what we see is data is being collected, it's being analyzed, it's being shared, it's being stored, it's being monitored, it's being mined, it's being hacked, and it's being sold. And this is your data. So you need to have an understanding of the value of your own data and what other folks are doing with it. And then we bring into the picture the marriage of this big data and then the tools you use to make meaning of that big data. So we have predictive analytics that is being applied to big data to understand patterns, identify risks and threats, and so that they can apply appropriately resources for addressing those needs. If you will, the next slide, please. So again, I want us to keep at the forefront of this conversation or this presentation this evening about what are the benefits and who is harmed by big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms. Because folks are definitely benefiting and folks are definitely being harmed. So our question for you is what can be done about it where you are right now? And we want you to not just think about this as the short term or the immediate, but the decisions that are being made around data right now have long-term consequences. What the decisions we make today will inform what's happening to us in 50 years and what's happening to our children in 50 years and what is happening to the information about us. Next slide, please. So I want to ground this conversation in a local case study, and that is in the Twin Cities in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the county, Ramsey County, an unprecedented legal agreement between multiple jurisdictions, including St. Paul Public Schools, the city of St. Paul, which includes St. Paul Police. And then we also had Ramsey County, which includes the Department of Probation, County Prosecutor's Office, Human Services, Public Health, Child Protection. So these three entities unanimously approved a unprecedented, expansive, very broad, and problematic legal agreement around integrated data sharing. So this agreement went into place not just to share the information, but they were intending to use and apply predictive analytics and algorithms so that they could produce risk scores and risk assessments for individual students with their data. And so in addition to doing this large scale cross data sharing agreement, the folks and the entities would be creating an entirely new board that would govern this data, and that community is structurally excluded from being a member of that board because it's state law that in order to protect data and privacy, only government officials are able to be on that board. But because of that statute and that law, there's a lack of transparency about how decisions will be made and how that data is managed and kept. So this story is a story of history and context in one community, how one joint powers agreement ballooned into a really big deal because it was going to be collecting data across multiple platforms and around students and their families. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is a story about St. Paul, the city of St. Paul Public Schools, the city of St. Paul, and Ramsey County Attorney's Office. And what I want to do is take you on a journey back in time, because as we're talking about big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms, and the Joint Powers Agreement that I just mentioned in St. Paul, it didn't just begin yesterday. It has been in the making for a significant amount of the time, but we were able to track it through public documents beginning back in 2014, when the county prosecutor's office in Ramsey County applied to the Bush Foundation for a community innovation grant. And that grant was intended to be used to engage community, have conversation about how to best support youth and families across systems and services. What you will see showing up in that grant is the language of predictive analytics and algorithms. And it's important for you to flag and understand that in this journey, because as those community engagement sessions came up and began to occur, that was not a part of the conversation that happened, but it was a document that we were able to go back to and look at to say, we know what the original intent was here. So after they applied for this grant to support community engagement around predictive analytics and big data, the team began to work with community engagement folks in the Twin Cities, where they would be able to gather large populations of people. They gathered folks in specific cultural groups and in different languages, and asked them the questions about what would need to happen in order for families, communities, and systems to work better together. After that happened, we don't see a lot of communication publicly about what came out of those sessions. There was a report, but there was a great deal of silence for about 2 years. But in those 2 years, if you follow the documents, you'll see that those entities, St. Paul, Ramsey County, and the district, were engaging in conversation with third sector capital to talk about the feasibility study of what a large-scale integrated data sharing platform might look like and how to fund it. At the same time, you see another vendor showing up in the community, offering and incentivizing districts and systems to work together and cooperate to collect data, and that the National Council of Crime and Delinquency would then be able to help and support them in applying the algorithm and using predictive analytics in order to kind of manage the information that they were collecting and use it as a way to identify those that might be at risk for interaction with the juvenile justice system. Another year where we didn't see a lot of conversation or information being shared about this joint powers agreement is that they had to investigate what a legal strategy would look like for a legal data sharing agreement. So each of the departments had to actually unpack what type of data did they had, what privacy concerns were they already grappling with, what type of systems do they have, and how advanced are the tools that they had to be able to work with each other to protect and share this data. And then finally, you see that all three of the entities unanimously approved this joint powers agreement. Next slide, if you will, please. And so I just wanted to show you what it looks like when something like this might show up in a local community. And so this is the actual joint powers agreement, and it shares here that who it is between. And it also suggests in the language that this joint powers agreement is not limited to just those that are a part of the agreement, and that it opens the door for other districts and other government entities to join in this governing board of integrated data sharing. Next slide, please. So here again, you see the name of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, who selected Ramsey County through this pilot to support the use of predictive analytics on the big data that they were proposing to share across systems, and that they would use this information again to identify risk at youth at risk for involvement with the juvenile justice system. When we pushed on this and asked a bit more about, once that they were identified with a risk score, what would happen next? And we were disappointed in our response that we received, not getting a clear vision of, yes, you might flag a student, but how does that actually prevent or provide other alternative opportunities for students not to get engaged with the juvenile justice system. So it did not actually seem like a completely thought out process. And then you also see on this page that they were talking about creating an early warning system that would flag students, again, for needing appropriate interventions to prevent future involvement with juvenile justice without any clarity on how that would go about, and also any clarity on what it would cost. What was also problematic in this joint powers agreement that we saw was that they were willing, under appropriate circumstances, to share information from the district that would not otherwise be available to them. And for us, this was a red flag, because we know that the sheriff's office is in the county and law enforcement is in the city, and that the chief of police would have more access to information and the police department would have more access to information than they previously had before. Next slide, please. So I also want to share with you, as we're talking about these integrated data sharing platforms in this case study, is that going back to the community engagement sessions that they hosted for a year and a half, is the community was very forthcoming with solutions that they suggested. They talked about building healthy relationships with youth. They talked about enhancing proactive, positive approaches to prevent and respond to conflict. They did talk about sharing and improving data within, but not across systems, but within the system of the school district or within a system of the county. They talked about increasing parent and guardian support, improving training, hiring, and development. All of these things that came out of that original community engagement did not actually show up in the joint powers agreement, but what you see is that they use the language of sharing and improving data within, and they expanded it to include and across systems. And they were able to use this strategy to compel elected officials to unanimously approve for this agreement, because it appeared that they had full community support. Next slide, please. So just to dive a little deeper into how predictive analytics and risk scores can possibly be used in the application or using big data, is that in St. Paul, in Ramsey County, they were, again, interested in flagging children who might have potential to be involved with juvenile justice. And they would decided to use indicators or particular factors that would say a child is more likely if they had this happen to them, if they experienced this. And so when they shared with us what indicators they were thinking about using, again, it was another red flag, because they were going to think about using the arrests of kids or the arrests of their siblings or their parents or their family's interaction with the police. So it didn't say what type of interactions, and it certainly didn't talk about how a child's family could be used to measure their own individual potential and possibility. From the county perspective, they were thinking about using child protection involvement, whether they had an out-of-home placement, if their family members or siblings had been in juvenile detention, if they were receiving any type of welfare support, or again, if their parents or family members had experienced adult incarceration. And again, a flawed look at data, it's from a very much a deficit-based approach, and it is not centering the child, it's centering their environment. But specifically, when we look at the school district data that they were interested in using to predict their involvement with the juvenile system, they suggested suspension. And immediately, for me, that was problematic, because in Minnesota, we have 43 school districts that were identified for discriminating and out-of-school suspensions for Black and Brown students. So if you're going to enter the data of those students, and St. Paul Public Schools being one of those schools, we know that it's flawed, and we know that that subjective data has demonstrated bias in it. And so literally you're using flawed bias and baking it into an algorithm that will then provide and present a risk score that doesn't really tell us much of a picture about a student. You also had folks suggesting that you use attendance data, knowing that attendance data can be wrong. You can have names that are mixed up and confused, and so you have one person's information being entered for another. They're using grades, your special education status, and free and reduced lunch status. That does not tell us enough about who you are as a person, as a student, and also what is the lens that this data was collected from in order to be used as a factor or an indicator in a predictive analytic approach. Next slide, please. So as we went through this process, we had to learn more about this big picture of what algorithms, big data, and predictive analytics are. And so we understood that in order to have an algorithm, you have to have a history, a context, a pattern in order to follow. You have to have a definition of success. And then what are the ingredients necessary in order to complete or fulfill that definition of success? So in big data, we're talking about large data sets, large pieces of information. And then you're examining the different trends or patterns that might show up in that data and make associations about them. If this, then that. And using that information to inform a risk score, using suspensions as indicators, absences indicators, or your special education status as indicators to create a risk score. And so all of that into the risk score, you put the predictive analytics, you have the historical data then, you have the patterns, and then you present the probability. And what we found in this analysis of algorithms, big data, predictive analytics, and this system, and how they were suggesting and proposing to do the joint powers agreement in St. Paul, is that it was really about raising awareness about people's potential to be involved in the juvenile justice system. It had a one person's perspective about what is the definition of success. And then this was really about social control, because the perception is that something is wrong with the children, and that the system needs to flag them in order to address it. If you will, the next slide, please. So we knew we had to do something about it, and so we decided to focus on educating, engaging, and activating our community. So we hosted seminars, webinars, we created a coalition, and we published a policy brief in order to get our concerns out there, because to that point, we really had not much response from the elected officials where we were asking questions about who benefits from this, what is the cost, and what is the potential harm. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a picture of us engaging in conversation with young people to talk about this potential joint powers agreement and the impact it might have on one's life. And as we had this conversation with the young people, they were just sitting there quietly, kind of taking it all in, processing it. At some point, we didn't know if it was too much information at once, if it was over everyone's head, because again, this is some intimidating language that is largely unfamiliar with our community. But as we met with the young people and they gave us feedback, we learned that as a young person was sitting in a classroom, she was looking around at her classmates, and all of a sudden she found herself trying to determine what the risk score might be for each of the members of her class. And she thought about, what would they assign for me as a risk score? And she said, if they used the last year of my life to tell a story about who I am and what my future potential is, I wouldn't believe that there was much in store for me. We were homeless and highly mobile. We had a lot going on at home, and things were just really stressed out at the time. But that was last year. That's a snapshot of my life. And if they just use that snapshot, they wouldn't know that I'm doing well in school. Things have stabilized at home. I've got caring adults at the school that are looking out for me, and I'm on path to do what I hope to do. But in the conversation around using predictive analytics and algorithms to make decisions about how resources are allocated, how students are flagged or identified, that information is, in the words of the student, that my past does not predict my future. So basically, she's telling us that we cannot get the full picture of a whole child simply from a tool, an algorithm, machine learning, or artificial intelligence. And she may not have said it in those words, but she would today because we've continued to engage in that conversation. But even young people, as they're learning about this emerging technological trend in education, they are noticing and identifying the potential harm and risks that are surfacing with folks' investment and enchantment with technology. Next slide, please. And so here you just have some pictures of us hosting community forums in order to deepen the conversation in community around what big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms are. And so we had community forums all over the place and recognized that this issue is so much bigger than what was just happening in St. Paul, and that for us, this was just a clarion call for us to better understand this trend and the impact it would have on community. Next slide, please. So in order for us to understand what this algorithm is and the impact that it could have in our community, we tried to create an algorithm for how we would gather our community together in order to address this joint powers agreement. And Dr. Talea Tolfree was instrumental in thinking through this algorithmic formula of how you would go explaining our community engagement for the summit. So if we think about, again, those same components we had for the algorithm in the earlier example, we have the history. So we would collect data around what is happening with the joint powers agreement. And the history that they've used secrecy as a tool. And so we knew that in our community summit, we had to be transparent about the information. We had to be transparent about our perspective on the information in order so people would be open to receiving it and that we did not have a particular agenda. And if we were thinking about predictive analytics and the community harm, all of these pieces went into play into how we would have to look at this history in order to construct a successful summit that would benefit community, because data, big data, has showed up in harmful ways in the community in the past. So we knew we had to acknowledge and recognize that. And so our definition of success was based on that historical context. So we knew that we would be successful if community was aware, they were educated and engaged and wanted to participate in this decision-making process and understand the power they had to do so. The ingredients we would get to help parents and youth and community members to get to that point of success is that we would host a community summit. We would share workshops, literature, restorative practices as avenues and ingredients towards success. So as you think about the social outcomes that we were looking for, is the awareness, the education, and the language, and that there are options on the table, that this is not a done deal. And that in this process, we added one more level that did not occur in the algorithm or the process the Joint Powers Agreement initially launched their program with, and that was transparency. So we created a feedback loop. So for each of these sets of points in the algorithmic pattern, we would check in with community to make sure we were on point. Did we have the accurate history? Did we have the right definition of success? What ingredients truly are necessary to fulfill and build that success? And are the social outcomes that we are seeking, do all of those things lead to that? And so for us, we have been learning to think about this work as our own algorithm, because algorithms in themselves are not bad. It's the application of an algorithm without transparency or a connection to the community and those that are impacted by what the algorithm produces. Next slide, please. And here are just some more pictures of that process for you, where we had community meetings and summits and conversations in order to build the muscle of community and having this conversation. Next slide, please. So just a little background about what we took on in this Joint Powers Agreement. We started gathering people before we fully understood what the joint powers was. We reached out to anyone who would listen. So Dr. Roxana Marachi was one of those people that responded and said, "You're not crazy. This is really happening, and this is not the beginning." Locally, we created a common language to talk about what this is. We coined it the cradle to prison algorithm because we understood how comprehensive and expansive the potential for this integrated data sharing could potentially be. We met with elected officials and system officials to learn more and weigh in. And we learned that as we were learning, we knew more than many of those folks that were supposed to be experts on this piece of work. We circle back to the original engagement participants to confirm what was it that you said in those spaces, so we can lift them up as an alternative to what the Joint Powers Agreement offered. We made transparent the process. We engaged the media. As we learned, we shared. And then we owned our knowledge and new collective expertise because we found that many times people were feeling intimidated by this technological language. So we had to break down that as a barrier in order for folks in the community to have a conversation about what was happening. And critically, we landed on this one point that really opened the door for us to be able to engage with others in this conversation. And that is, we started to identify points of entry for everyone. Next slide, please. So recognizing points of entry means everybody has a different story about big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms, because even though you may not be aware of what they are, your life is impacted by them already. So it's not a point of entry of where you are, it's you discovering where your point of entry is now. And so your point of entry might be that you are the data scientist that constructs the algorithm. You might be in the juvenile justice system and have already had predictive analytics applied because that is where these vendors are transitioning over from the juvenile justice system into the education system. The point of entry for me, the example of the discipline disparities and suspensions being used as an indicator would be a point of entry. For many of our parents locally, it was in their back to school agreements where if they did not sign off on a social media policy or another policy, that their child might be prevented from using an iPad for a tool at school. It might be through criminalizing infrastructure such as cameras and other pieces. And so these are all different ways that we've been able to wrap this conversation around community members so that they can see themselves in it. Next slide, please. And again, we just got out there and we started having conversations and used really creative ways in order to get the message out and engage people in this conversation, because big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms is not the sexiest conversation to be having with your neighbor, but it is a critical one. Next slide, please. So what we walk away from in this situation, and these are some of the recommendations that come out of the Coalition to Stop the Cradle to Prison Algorithm policy brief that we created, is that communities oppose this data sharing agreement, which we believe will function as a cradle to prison algorithm, because we believe that it racially profiles children as future criminals. We believe it stigmatizes children and families by assigning them risk scores or flagging them for services. We believe that this actually diverts system resources towards study and surveillance rather than the services that are lifted up in those community engagement sessions and the alternatives that folks wanted investment in besides the Joint Powers Agreement and the predictive analytics approach. And finally, what we found most disturbing and problematic about how they were applying big data, predictive and analytics and algorithms is in their historical context. They were completely ignoring the system responsibilities for correcting disparities that did not begin with our children, but were being considered the burden that they would carry through a risk score or an assessment. So again, by ignoring system responsibilities for correcting those disparities and using a deficit lens and attaching that to children, to us, is not a solution that is viable and one that we're willing to risk and invest any type of resources in. Next slide, please. So the good news is the JPA is dissolved, and that it has been tabled. We know that it's not going to be gone forever, but in the meantime, we are scaling up a massive campaign of education, engagement, and activation. Next slide, please. And it's called the Data for Public Good campaign. Next slide, please. So we want to take what we learned from our local data sharing agreement and the journey we took about what needs to happen elsewhere so that it's not duplicated or replicated in such a harmful way. So in our Data for Public Good campaign, our first phase is engaging with community members across the country that will be willing to gather data around these trends in education, around big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms. And we actually just had a webinar yesterday, an informational webinar to share how you can become an information and a data gatherer in your local community. We also have been working on prototyping a simplifying data primer so that as folks are beginning their conversation and navigating this, they'll have a tool to rely on for the language and for the definitions that you might need in order to do a search or to have further conversation. Next slide, please. So phase two is once we gather all that information, we're going to bring folks back together and unpack what we learned, what we know, and what we need to share. We're going to do a deeper dive. But at that point, we're also looking to create a heat map that will follow the emerging technological trend in education to show in which communities it's showing up, where it already exists, where it's emerging, what type of policies are in place, who are the vendors that are being allowed into these spaces, and what are the outcomes of all these things that are happening across the country. So it's our goal to capture that information and begin to track it so that it's not a surprise for folks as it shows up. Because one of the things that we've learned in this process is this is not limited to urban communities. This is happening in rural, suburban, urban. Wherever there are people, there's data, and that is where this trend is going to lead. And so in addition to getting folks together, yes, the next slide, please. We're going to be working on the ground to support communities, to engage their communities in the conversation, and to make sure that there is no privacy without the expectation of privacy, and so that folks on the ground can grapple with what does that mean for them? How does that need to show up here, and what can we do? And we're also going to be having driving recommendations so that folks will know how to advise their local elected officials as this comes up. And then we're also going to be designing a collaborative policy tool to make sure as these policies come up, we're aware of them, and that the language that is used really does ensure safety and protect privacy. Next slide, please. So we'd love to have you become a part of the movement, join the Data for Public Good campaign. Here's the email where you can sign up to say you'd like to participate in the survey, you'd like more information about the campaign. But at this time, I'd like to pass the webinar over to Dr. Roxana Marachi, and she will take you to the next level and giving you a sense beyond just this local community. What else is showing up, and why does it matter?
All right, as we transition, yes. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marika, for everything that you just presented. And it was amazing to hear more of the details about what is happening in Twin Cities, because I heard so many really important intersections and connections to what I've been noticing locally here in Santa Clara County and some of the similar trends that we have. So I'll share a little bit more about that later on. And so much of what you covered as well are very similar trends to what I'll be sharing about. So we'll go more quickly, I think, through my slides. And I think I have a lot of slides too, so I'll go quickly. So again, my name is Roxana Marachi. I am the education chair of the California NAACP. also an associate professor of education at San Jose State University. My early research focused a lot on school climate, and I did a lot of evaluations of school violence prevention programs. I was in graduate school at the time that Columbine had happened, and I saw a lot of our schools being bombarded with a lot of different programs and interventions promising to keep our students safer and to have, you know, lower levels of bullying, et cetera. And so I became really interested in how what kind of the interventions that are proposed and the extent to which they actually work, because sometimes the marketing is really good, but what is being marketed can actually do more harm than good. And I've noticed a lot of similar trends with the influx of technology in schools and with a lot of kind of what is being promised by the sector of folks that are trying to privatize public education as well. So it just gives you kind of context about some of the things that I've researched and why it might sound like it's a lot of different areas of focus, but very interested in is really understanding what is actually working, what's actually helping our youth, and what might be inadvertently, unfortunately, harming our youth. So the next slide, we'll go to, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, and this is just an image, that last image was just to show how much technology is really infiltrating and being pushed into a lot of our school systems. And this is something that Marika has also mentioned too, about the value of information. We're in the fourth industrial revolution now. This is where information is the new gold. It's the new oil. It's like diamonds. It's worth trillions of dollars. And if you control that, you control wealth, you control power. This is a quote from a documentary that I think really illustrates the power differential between those who want to extract the data and those who are giving up the data. And I think that one of the hashtags that I've seen recently is not your data. That'll be another slide in a bit. And I think that we need to have a conversation about consent and the importance of ensuring that when technological interventions are being disseminated, that if there are data being gathered, especially sensitive data from youth, there needs to be in full informed consent from their parents and from the youth themselves, and opportunities to opt out. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so where the information is going, these are the big 5 companies that are gathering the most amount of information on us: Apple, Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. And I would say in the education space, it would definitely be Google and Amazon that take the largest share of the data. Amazon has a program called Ed Start, where they have over 300 educational technology companies that are storing their data on the Amazon Web Services servers. And a lot of learning management systems are also storing their data in Amazon Web Services. And a lot of folks aren't really asking, where do the data go and how do they get used? And so there's a lot of concern about privacy and the use of these data in some of these larger systems. And it also speaks to the concerns that Marika was speaking to about big data. These are the companies that are engaging in big data and predictive analytics. And so we need to think critically about the companies to which we're sending data. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so this was just the hashtag, not your data. It's one of the better hashtags that I've seen out there that has some of the current trends and information from some of the privacy activists and parents and folks who are concerned about the use of data and the misuse of data on youth. It also, there's some trends worth paying attention to in many cities, such as smart cities. So these are attempts to try to integrate more surveillance technologies into cities that would then also be integrated into some of these large data systems, many of which intersect with education, intersect with the police departments, intersect with some of the other larger agencies as well. And so we need to be vigilant about some of those systems as well. You can go to the next slide. I should have probably done a disclaimer at the beginning of this talk as well. My apologies that a lot of what I'm sharing is difficult to listen to. It's been difficult for me as a researcher to discover some of these trends and to know that they're happening. I do think it's really important that we reveal what's happening, where it's coming from, and how we can hopefully create better guardrails to protect ourselves and our data. One thing I forgot to mention too at the beginning when I shared my affiliation that I'm a professor at San Jose State University is that I do need to clarify that I do not, the things that I've been researching is not necessarily the position of the university. We have to do that to clarify and to protect academic freedom. So I just forgot to mention that, and I thought I should do it as we get into some of the more details of companies and the entities that are going to be profiting from a lot of this data. So this next slide here basically shows some trends. And so I wanted to really give a big picture macro perspective on where some of the legislation is coming from, where a lot of the trends are coming from, deeply rooted in Silicon Valley and also deeply rooted in some of the organizations that are pushing corporate supporting initiatives that are technologizing and datafying our society. And so these are just two articles. One is about how online learning companies bought America's schools, and the other one is about the role of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and pushing a lot of legislation that is bringing more technology and virtual and online learning into our education spaces. And so as you think about this, a lot of what we're critiquing is going to be systems that are in place in our public systems, and this is where we have an opportunity to actually crack open and look at and interrogate and to change our systems. And the concern about them becoming privatized is that once it's privatized, then we have no voice, we have no way to crack it open and to say what's going on. And so I just wanted to also mention that, and so that these intersections of educational technology and school privatization are deeply intertwined. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is an article by Natasha Singer in the New York Times from a few years ago, just documenting the large amount of funding that's going into schools that's rooted from Silicon Valley and pushing a lot of the technology products and software and databases and everything that are going to be extracting data. You can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. Again, I've got a lot of slides, so we'll be going quickly through these. Thank you. Okay, this next slide, I wanted to really highlight the importance of youth voice. And I wish that this image that we had to see was actually the pictures of the students who were protesting this summit platform. But this is an article that highlights, and it was just last year, I think it was November of last year, where there was a kind of an expose of students in Brooklyn who learned about this Summit platform. Summit started, it's a charter school chain that has started, and then they've also developed a technology platform that they are giving away for free to public schools as well to push what is called personalized learning. And there's a lot of doublespeak in a lot of the marketing that you might see around technology, because it's actually a lot of what happens in personalized learning is depersonalized. And so in this case, the students who were very frustrated with the platform looked into the data and the data sharing and wrote an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, asking this very critical question at the end, basically, what gives you this right to invade our privacy and to not ask for our consent in doing so? Next slide, please. And I think that this is also strikes with the same spirit that Marika is talking about, of giving students an opportunity to learn about what's happening and then to be able to ask those critical questions. This next slide here just describes some of the kinds of data that they had discovered, that Summit is collecting our names, student ID numbers, email addresses, attendance, disability, suspension and expulsion records, race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, date of birth, teacher observations of our behavior, grade, promotion, retention status, test scores, grades, etc. College admissions, the list goes on. And they had discovered too that they would potentially have the capacity to be able to disclose this to 19 other corporations. And if you really look at the privacy policies of many of these companies, they say very clearly, we reserve the right to share this information with our affiliates, with our investors, et cetera. And so this is something that we need to really pay closer attention to. And I just want to give kudos and shout out to the students in Brooklyn who protested this and again asked, what gives you the right? Why weren't we asked about this before you invaded our privacy in this way? I think this is something that also needs to happen in higher education settings as well. We'll focus on K-12 for now, given the webinar, but this extends across many different levels. Okay, thank you. And I'm hearing some background noise. I don't know if that's where that's coming from, but I'm hoping it's not me. I don't think there's any background noise here. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to mention, and I do have a lot of information which is still only scratching the surface, but there are two trends I think are really important for us as folks in the education community to pay attention to. One, and both of these trends, you probably heard really positive things about them. That's things that we've been advocating for years because this is what has been shown to be helpful for youth. And this one is social emotional learning, having healthy social emotional learning climates, emphasis on relationships, emphasis on empathy and caring, and then also trauma informed, recognizing that youth who've experienced trauma are going to need supports, and we need to approach them with compassion and caring and assuming the best in their situations and not blaming or shaming or punishing them. And so both of these original movements, social emotional learning and trauma informed, I think came from authentic spaces of caring for youth. And what we've seen recently is that both of these trends have recently, I'd say in the last probably 3 or 4 years, have become hijacked. And what I mean by that is that it has moved from an authentic relationship-based approaches to becoming something where a technology company is going to now come into your district and is pitching to measure and track and help you with your school climate by telling you where you are and how you can improve. And on the surface, it sounds really good, but we really have to be mindful about where these data are going and the kinds of sensitive data that are being gathered about youth. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so again, just this emphasis that, again, the authentic, relational-based, social and emotional learning matters. We're not suggesting to throw that out just because, the SEL acronym is now attached to a lot of these tech-based initiatives. We just need to really think critically and to differentiate the authentic SEL from the behavior measuring type of SEL, where there's data, there are data and sensitive data being gathered about students' behavior and their emotions, their responses, their coping strategies, et cetera. We know from an organization called the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy that many parents are reporting many examples of very intrusive questions that are being asked of students without their parents' consent, about their families, about their emotions, attitudes, and behaviors. So that's just something to pay attention to. I have another slide later about Parent Coalition for Student Privacy. They do a lot of good work advocating on behalf of students and families for data protections. We'll go to the next slide. The next few slides have examples of how some of these things can look in schools. It might be a really attractive, online program that has modules that are going to be marketed to help your students learn social skills, or and again, this relates to what Marika was saying. There's a lot of social control in the design of some of these things, and it's troubling and problematic when you look at how much of it is based on a deficit model of youth. And so it can, on the surface, look like, oh, this is helping and supporting youth, but there's a lot of data being gathered through these systems. And when this is a slide from a presentation of a colleague in Philadelphia, she has a blog called wrenchinthegears.com, and she had highlighted this. This is base education. It's one of these social emotional learning online modules. And look at the bottom, it says the ability to record deleted text. That's extremely troubling. If students are typing in something, maybe they were frustrated by their teacher, or they were upset about something, but then it's actually recording that text, and they might have deleted it. Student might have thought, probably shouldn't write that. But then now it's this intrusive kind of recording of what's in that student's mind. This is very problematic. Students do not know that these kinds of things that they're typing into are actually recording their thoughts. I think we've got to protest that, and at the very least, let students know these are the kinds of data that are being gathered on them. Next slide, please. Many of these social emotional learning tools are going to come in the form of games. And so you're going to see a lot of examples of gamification and, making SEL be this next thing that kids can learn by leveling up, and it's engaging and all of these things. And it's got cartoons and whatnot. But then again, underneath the structure are these attempts to try to measure these different kinds of skills, including what they're calling, social emotional learning and collaboration skills. And so at the bottom of this, you'll see here behavioral data, which can be used with educational data mining techniques to assess students' learning competencies. This would also go for some of those behavioral tools as well, unfortunately. And so we need to be concerned, I think, about the ways that these data would then go into some of those predictive models that Marika was talking about. Next slide, please. Okay, so back when Cambridge Analytica had happened, this was a screenshot that I had gotten from one of the news stories where there was this more kind of public awareness about the fact that these psychological data are being gathered on all of us, right? And so I want you to kind of think about what's happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and these attempts to try to measure our personalities. The same kind of thing is happening in the schools right now. So the big data, psychological profiling, and predictive analytics, all of this is happening with the same lens towards this attempt to try to predict behavior. The tech companies are very interested in children's data because it's longitudinal, and with the more data points that they have, then they're going to say that statistically they can have stronger prediction models. And again, I would go back to what the student was saying in Marika's example, that our past does not predict our future. And those past data are very troubling and problematic to try to predict what's happening in the future. And so it's interesting as a researcher, we appreciate data and we use data all the time, but I think it really has to be gathered ethically. And so this widespread extraction of data in ways where the respondents and the participants don't even know is extremely, I think, unethical, and we should not be gathering these kinds of data. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the most troubling trends that I've seen, and that doesn't always make it, these kinds of intersections of why all the big data are so problematic, is that then these also can then get swept up into predictive models for policing. And so this is a book, it's just the screenshot of the cover of a book by Andrew Ferguson, who's written about the rise of big data policing. And so if you look carefully at a lot of the different trends that are intersecting our city governments and police departments and education systems, there is movement towards interoperability and the sharing of these interagency data that would then allow for these kinds of big data analytics to happen, where it's rooted in police departments and in the justice system, where they're going to be trying to predict the likelihood of a youth, to do well or not. And it's, again, troubling. I feel like I'm a broken record with all these commentaries I have on each slide. We'll go to the next slide. Again, you'll see a lot of this is echoing the concerns that Marika has raised. Next slide, please. So this is the most recent, I think it was within the last week it was published, that last slide that had a screenshot there. This is from Ben Williamson, who's a researcher in the UK, who's written a piece on psychodata, and he has really outlined academically this SEL movement and the attempt to gather the social emotional learning data. He's done a deep dive into the OECD's recent study on social emotional learning skills. and looking at how not only is this just to try to improve, social emotional learning and climates in schools, but that they're attempting to map that to socioeconomic outcomes. And so this is alluding to another whole sector of kind of this rising interest in impact investing and human capital, and being able to try to predict a person's economic worth later in life. And it's very troubling. And so this is just something to pay attention to. I'd recommend his blog. It's Code Acts in Education. He has a summary of that piece with a lot of the key kind of warnings, I think, to educators about this trend and where it's headed. Again, social emotional learning has come with all kinds of positive outcomes. And so we're not saying to do away with the relational supports, but to pay attention to where the data being gathered on the behavioral aspects of children's lives can then be used against them later. We want to prevent that weaponization of the data. Next slide, please. And how are we doing for time? How much time do I have left?
See, it is 7:10 right now, and so you're doing good on time. We're fine. You got some more time.
Okay, I'll do like another 15 minutes or so. Okay, if that's okay. So again, social emotional learning, trauma informed, take a critical lens towards these. The reason I included trauma informed is that there's a push right now in many states to have early screenings. So trying to screen children at a very young age for adverse childhood experiences. I think 10 years ago, this was really popular because of the notion that we could provide, again, more supports and more empathic responses to the youth. Very concerned that if these data of adverse childhood experiences get swept up into the big data predictive analytics, a lot of health insurance companies are going to be very interested in that. Those data have been and unfortunately predictive of different health outcomes. That's where a lot of the early research on trauma informed had started. And so that could end up having negative consequences for youth who might be marked at a higher risk of potential health problems later on as well. And so again, we want to protect against these things. And so just having a critical lens on trauma informed, even though the intended response in schools is for more compassion and adaptive responses to youth, it's the data collection part of it that we're concerned about. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this is an example of where a lot of pitches are being made to school districts that are using the language of social emotional learning and whole child approach integrated with this technological language of interoperability and using the data for benefit, data-driven instruction and things like that. I listened to this webinar as a company called Power School, and what we traditionally think of as educators about a whole child approach was nowhere in the webinar as far as attending to all the different facets of child development that matter. It was purely about data. It was about interoperability, and which is a fancy word basically for data sharing. And so we want to also encourage a critical lens of when you see these kinds of pitches for technology firms to come in and swoop in and save the day and teach us about how to take a whole child approach. We've got to really look at, does the intervention actually match the outcomes? Is it actually going to help or potentially might hurt the youth involved? Next slide, please. So interoperability is a big word. Let's look it up. Here it is. This is definition. Ability of a system. This is actually rooted in the military, such as a weapons system, to work with or use parts or equipment of another system. So another way to think about this in terms of data and multiple data systems is data sharing. It just means that one system can share the data with another. And again, connecting back to what Marika was talking about, there was support for sharing data within systems, but not across systems. And what interoperability is now allowing for, and oftentimes in problematic ways, is this data sharing across systems. And so that's something that we want to pay attention to and put guardrails up against so that it wouldn't be used against youth. Next slide, please. And then this is one of the slides from that particular webinar that just illustrates a lot of the different kinds of data that get shared, that get shared across these different systems. And you'll see in the middle in the blue there, attendance, behavior intervention, course grades, roster and program data, SAT, ACT, PSAT, state test data. There's a lot in there. And if some of you have been following what's recently happening with the SAT and the ways that they are also sharing data with colleges and universities, I would encourage checking out the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy. They have recent updates about how parents can opt their children out of the behavioral data sharing parts of the SAT. But this slide is really just to show how extensive the data sharing is already kind of baked into the data systems that might be being pitched in some of the schools. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's an organization that's called Global Silicon Valley Asset Management. I came across a big report that they had done about 7 years ago. It was published in 2012 on Independence Day. And the name of the title of this report is How American Revolution 2.0, How Education Innovation is Going to Revitalize America and Transform the US Economy. It's enormous, it's over 330 pages. And it was basically a massive market analysis and a promotion of how through privatization and through technology apps and software programs, education was going to be transformed and the ways that Silicon Valley was basically going to come in and save the day. And so this is just a screenshot on the right of some of the apps and programs that were highlighted in the report. There are many, many more. We can go to the next slide, and I have a short link as well in the next couple of slides. But I wanted to just give you a scope of the market that they're after. $6.4 trillion global education market. Pre-K is growing the fastest. We'll go to the next slide quickly. We have the US K-12 education market is estimated to be at about $712 billion. And then all those circles around that middle part are the ways that they kind of have their strategy is to capture that market. Next slide, I believe, is going to be the pre-K market, which is growing very rapidly at $70 billion. And again, the different kinds of strategies they have to capture that market in the next slide. And so then at the end of this report, they have a strategic battle plan. That there's a lot of war terminology in that report. And it's indicating a 15-year plan of kind of where they're headed from 2012 all the way up to 2027. And it's a lot of small print. You can actually download and read the original report. There's a bit.ly link at the bottom. But I highlighted in red some of the key things that I thought were aligned with some of the troubling trends that we've seen. The increase in the testing, charter schools and school choice, the kind of privatization as a vehicle for a lot of this technologization, turbocharging Teach for America, and then a very troubling one here, eliminating locally elected school boards is one of their stated desires here in their strategic battle plan, and eventually 100% merit pay for teachers, and then eventually an open online campus, which is surprisingly happening in our community college. One of our community college new proposals is an open online campus. Next slide. So one of the things you'll notice as you look at the trends is that many of these initiatives are targeting low-income communities with this promise for better education, for higher graduation rates. And it's, it's almost like this, what's it called? Disaster capitalism, right? Where they are able to come in and say, oh, look at what a disaster the current system is, and let's come and give you the solutions. And so here's an example. This was one of the companies that was highlighted in that report. The ACLU did an investigative expose of this BUZZ program, and found that it was not working. There were all kinds of problems with this ed tech program. It exploited the most vulnerable kids in Detroit. And then next slide, ironically, and because there isn't enough communication around these things, Digital Promise highlights that same ed tech program as a success, and they're getting smart review of 100 schools worth visiting. And so I'm glad that we have this webinar series, because I think we need to really dig deeper and to be able to have kind of some kind of shared documents around what programs and products have been effective or have been ineffective, and to share with communities to not fall into the same traps that some of our other communities have already fallen into. I think what you shared, Marika, about Twin Cities is happening in other spaces, and we need to learn from each other about how best to protect our communities. Next slide, please. And this will be another example at an earlier age level of where, again, our low-income communities are being targeted. And so this is an article from, I think it was the Washington Post. I was shocked by it at first when I saw it. I thought it was an onion piece, and there is an onion piece on online education. I think it's the only online preschool. It's the only situation where the satire and the reality is matching. But this is a legit article that was published. It says preschool is good for children, but it's expensive. So Utah is offering it online. And I got curious and I looked at the original title of the article. I always like to see how titles are, scrubbed or changed. And the original title actually read, and you can see it in the URL, original URL, preschool is good for poor kids, but it's expensive. So Utah is offering it online. So they're targeting low-income communities to push this, cheaper, what they're calling as a version of preschool, and it is not, because it's an ed tech program, which has all kinds of concerns about data extraction underneath it as well. But these, again, are being pitched as innovations that are going to support our communities. And again, we need to ask the questions about where the data are going and if they're actually helping or hurting. You look at the bottom of this article, some of the funders of these kinds of things are the same funders that we're seeing that are pushing impact investing. JB Pritzker is one of them. And you'll see in this early learning space, and there is really good movement to try to support early learning. I think all of us want to have access for our communities to have access to high quality early learning. Unfortunately, some of the initiatives are being pushed by folks who are deeply tied in with these tech-based programs that are going to be promoted to try to find impact, and then that impact is going to be coming through these datafied systems. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to give some good news in all of this, that there are folks that are paying attention to these trends and that are trying to raise awareness about the concerns. And so there's a group of researchers at Cardiff University, the Data Justice Lab. They're looking at some of these trends. They've launched a couple of years ago, and they've done kind of an analysis of all the different data harms. And I appreciate their work. I've reached out and talked a couple of times with them, and I just wanted to share some of the work that they're doing that I think aligns with ours, and maybe we can share resources as well. We'll go quickly through the next few slides, but it's just information that I think is helpful. This is part of the launch that they had done in a video that's linked at the bottom. And then, yeah, it's just talking about data justice. And one of the things that they're emphasizing, that it's not enough to be able to just say, for individuals, how do you protect yourself? We have to look at systemic solutions. And so this is where I think some of our work can come in. Next slide is the video that they have. And then some of the questions that they had asked, how do we address possible harms and challenges for social justice? And are the calls for individual privacy and encryption tools sufficient? Again, emphasizing the need for systemic protections. And Lena Denchik and Arnie Heinz are the two who had presented in this. I won't have time to show a clip of this, but the link is there, and I'm glad to share the slides afterwards as well. Next slide, please. and I'll go quickly through the rest. So part of what they had presented in their presentation was about all of these data inputs and then the outputs and the way that they are being put into these predictive algorithms. So this is just another visual to represent what Marika had mentioned earlier about the kinds of data and algorithms that are being used to then try to predict outcomes later. And again, very problematic in terms of assuming that pasts will predict futures, and a lot of false data oftentimes being entered into these algorithms, and then no opportunity for people to be able to opt out. Next slide, please. There is an organization called Privacy International that has a really excellent video on data exploitation. So for our viewers and listeners who are wanting to learn more, this is just a really brief video that introduces what a data exploitation is, and towards the middle of it, about 1 minute 37 mark, it really highlights the concerns about the predictive analytics. Next slide, please. And this is the part where it really highlights that it's not, you know, a lot of times when people think that you're concerned about data and data privacy, they think it might be about ad trackers and advertising, and they say, oh, I don't care if, you know, Domino's wants to send me pizza, or if I get Nike ads or whatever it might be. There's a lot of dismissing of the concerns because they think that that's all it is. It's just ad tracking, but it's not. It's more than just advertising. It's that these kinds of data would then be used to limit opportunities later in life, and so that could impact loan acceptances or decisions that are made in the justice system, car insurance payments, health payments, etc. Next slide. The Data Justice Lab, Joanna Redden, who's the director of the lab, wrote a piece last year. She's the co-director of the Data Justice Lab. She wrote a piece in the conversation last year highlighting these 6 main forms of data harms: targeting based on vulnerability, misuse of personal information, discrimination, data breaches, political manipulation, social harm, and then data and system errors. And these are trends that they've been finding throughout their work. And again, with an attempt to educate the public and then provide guardrails and protections and supports so that these kinds of data would not be used for harm. Next slide, please. So this brings us to kind of the current state that we're at right now in education, some areas that I think we really have to pay attention to as activists. Last year, when I was looking at the role that Chan Zuckerberg initiative has in education, it's troubling the amount of power that they are wielding in a lot of our systems. And so I noticed, it was a search that I had done online, came across a PDF of a presentation that they had done back in February of this past year. And this is just a screenshot from that I took that really highlights these different kinds of data from all different aspects of students' lives that they're very interested in gathering. I don't know what the current status is of any formal partnership with the California State Department of Education and Chan Zuckerberg initiative, but this is something that I think needs to be explored. And if there's any kind of a public protest or will against this, I think that would be a good thing, because the private foundation should not have access to these kinds of data or drive the policy decision-making of our public school system. Again, it's going to be done in a frame of, you know, supporting youth, but we've got to really look at where the data are going. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the connections of what's happening in Minneapolis, because there are some that I think, Marika, you and I need to talk after this webinar too, because you mentioned something about the Joint Powers Agreement in Minneapolis that sent red flags, you know, alarming in my mind, because you mentioned third sector capital partners, which is an entity that is also deeply integrated with our Santa Clara County Office of Education partners, doing this work with our county partners in this Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust. I remember the name clearly because I've also done other research on some of the early trends with that organization as well. And so this is just to show that how deeply embedded the funding from Chan Zuckerberg appears to be in our local systems. I would be very interested to see if they might have any kind of connection to the Minneapolis work as well. But the next slide, this slide is just showing kind of this launch of this Silicon Valley Regional Data Trust, and the software that is the partner being used to do the predictive analytics on the youth who are in many of, not all, but many of the districts that are part of this data zone in Santa Clara County. It's called Who Knew It, HOONUIT, and it's pronounced Who Knew It, as in like who knew it, we did. And so this is a screenshot from one of the videos that they have on their website about using predictive analytics to identify, quote, at-risk students to get them back on track. And again, that language that echoes what Marika had mentioned in her part of the presentation about early warning and intervention systems. That's the same exact language that was of concern in Twin Cities that we're also seeing here in Santa Clara County. And I think, again, the difference between Twin Cities and Santa Clara County is that you've done a tremendous amount of work to inform the community about what's going on. And we have not done that yet. And I think it's something that we need to do. This is a video that's available. It's on the Who Knew It page if you look up early warning intervention. And again, this categorizing of youth into low risk, medium risk, and high risk is very troubling for anyone who works in education and knows that the stigmatizing and labeling of youth in this way can be extremely harmful. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we can do is to demand algorithmic transparency. And that is to uncover the algorithms, to ensure that the kinds of formulas that are being put into these data systems to try to determine a risk score, that we can see what those formulas are, and that we can have a voice and say, no, this should not be happening. We shouldn't be, doing this kind of risk profiling. EPIC has some resources on algorithmic transparency, and then I also have an attachment under the handouts from the Association for Computing Machinery at the statement on algorithmic transparency with principles of algorithmic transparency. There are dozens of these out there. I thought that one was particularly good because I was talking about some of the bias. One point of caution I will make here is that I think it's not enough to just say, oh, these systems are biased, let's unbias them, because some of them are just inherently racist and problematic, and we shouldn't be gathering the data to begin with. And so future conversations to be had there, but I thought that was a screenshot that was worth sharing, just ensuring that we can at least see and there's transparency around the kinds and around the ways that the data are being used. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is actually highlighting the work of Minneapolis and being able to cancel the data sharing contract. And so you heard all about that in Marika's presentation, but I just wanted to give a shout out and kudos to the Twin Cities community for being able to put a halt to that. And a lot of what we hear, I mean, again, I'm in the heart of Silicon Valley here. And so whenever I've expressed concern about these things, the response has been, Roxana, it's just too late. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and this is inevitable. It's just going to happen, and you need to, accept it and deal with it. And I just think that that's really troubling and problematic, and that we shouldn't just accept it and deal with it. I think we can make a change, and we need to make a change if we're going to protect the next generation from data exploitation. And so kudos to the Twin Cities and Minneapolis for being able to do that in action. Next slide. And I think this is getting really close to the end. Okay, yeah, so just a couple of cautions that a lot of the solutions are going to come in language of impact investing and solutions, and even Marika had mentioned sort of like the innovative community solutions and things like that, and grants. And so just pay attention to that, because depending on how they want to demonstrate impact, it could be rooted to some of these smart contracts and technological data systems that would be actually the ones that would be doing more harm than good. And so I just wanted to put an urge of caution for impact investing. They would be connected to some of the solutions. One of the things that's being pitched right now is to own your own data, and blockchain is one of the new technologies that's being marketed as a solution for some of the concerns about data privacy. But that is not a solution. And in fact, we have a lot of information about very serious security and privacy threats with blockchain, and there's a lot of opposition among civil rights organizations against it. So just as a heads up, and maybe that's another webinar, but I would just urge caution against privatization of our public systems through these kinds of innovative financial tools, because they can actually do more harm than good. Next slide, please. And so what can we do? I think we can be aware of some of these pending trends: social impact bonds, pay for success, outcomes-based contracting. These are tied often to the push for longitudinal data sets, et cetera. So opposing those would be one first step. Providing community education about data harms, data exploitation, and the need for data justice. That's a lot of what has already happened on the ground in Minneapolis. Rejecting legislation that would push longitudinal state database systems that would track youth from birth through schooling and work. This is a really important one for folks who are following legislative trends and patterns, and to put a halt to these systems before they stop. And then finally, holding public forums about data privacy, security processes, et cetera, and opportunities for opting out of programs that would contribute data to predictive profiling. Next slide. Parent Coalition for Student Privacy is one of the organizations that I'm aware of that does really good work communicating to parents. So I think potentially partnering with them, or maybe for the next webinar, and just building our network of folks who are concerned about and wanting to take action on these issues. They have an educator toolkit for teacher and student privacy as a kind of a first step for some of the data protection. And then the next slide is of a privacy group of privacy researchers at UC Berkeley that have developed an interesting app and analysis tool that you can access online, and you can enter the name of different software tools to see what the analysis is. And I've done already an analysis of many learning management systems and ed tech programs that are pitching to be safe and secure, but that actually UC Berkeley researchers have found are transmitting sensitive data and information. So this is just a tool that anyone listening can use. If you're curious about your children's apps on your phones, or a new program that's going to be adopted by your school district, you can look it up yourself and then maybe share that data as well. Just a tool that I think is useful. Next slide. And I think this is the last slide. It should be. That's it. Yeah, and I have a blog at the bottom there. I have some content curation pages as well on educational psychology and technology, and then also social impact bond gamble. That's another one at the bottom there. And then on Twitter, and my handle is ConnectEdProf. Glad to connect with anyone. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so very much for that. Fantastic work, fantastic presentations, both of you, and we are still in good timing. It is 7:38 on the East Coast, so 4:38 on the West Coast, and so we scheduled this to run till 8 p.m. Eastern time. So we got about 20 minutes left, and I know there's still a few of us in the chat room, and I know Marika, there's a couple of things that you want to add to the fold. I definitely want to encourage folks on the webinar as part one, again, of this digital intensive to share what you've learned, share what intrigued you, share what scared you, and connect with folks who are, holding this work down and doing it. So want to bring in Liz from DSC and Esri to see if there are any questions that have come up in the chat bar that we can field. There's a little time for some Q&A, and if there are questions that came up during the chat, or if there are questions that you have now, go ahead and throw those in the chat bar or the question bar, and we can kind of get to those as best we can. So Liz, are there any questions that kind of came in that we can field?
Yeah, there are two questions that came in, so I'll share these, and whoever feels like answering can go ahead and jump in. The first one is from someone in Portland sharing that Portland Public Schools has signed on to Project Unicorn. For the past 2 years, they've been trying to get information about the interoperability platform and how Portland Public Schools is obligated by the contract, and they have been not being able to find anything out. So anyone else have experience with Project Unicorn or anything else folks can share on that particular platform?
I saw Marika nodding her head in when you just mentioned that. So Marika, would you like to take this one? It looks like she's still muted.
Let's see if we can mute her.
I would simply say steer clear of Project Unicorn. Very serious concerns about the data and the privacy and security. And I could probably send more information. I've got a colleague in Philadelphia who's done a lot more detailed analysis. But I hear that, and the red flags go off because of the concerns that we've seen around that. Marika, did you want to add?
You should be able to unmute yourself now, Marika.
There we go. I think, okay. Yeah, we've got you, Marika.
Hi, you can hear me? Okay. I don't have a deep knowledge of Project Unicorn. It has come up. I would be interested if you could type your information into the chat box so we could follow up offline and just see if there's any other information we could dig up for you or support. And we're certainly interested to hear more about what's happening on the ground with that.
Yeah, the question came from Deb Mayer, and I can share her information.
Great.
With both of you. Another question that came in, what do you think about Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's push to screen every child for trauma before entering school? Is this problematic? We have a community-based organization seeking to rest in between the tech measurement and the school sites where we manage these authentic relationships. So just, yeah, a question about that.
So I brought it up in my part of the slide, so I'd like to be able to respond. I'm a fan of Nadine Burke-Harris's work. I've shared her TED Talk with my students because of the emphasis on supporting a compassionate approach to youth who've experienced trauma. I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the push for early screening of trauma and the measurement of the ACEs. I think there's a blind spot, and not an intentional one. That I don't think that, I think, you know, I trust that she would do what's right for kids. And I worry that she may not be aware of the way that the data could end up being used longitudinally. I would ask very serious questions about where the data are being stored, what servers they're being stored in, what the data sharing agreements are between the schools, and how those ACE scores are being used. I have heard among colleagues who are in schools where they are doing very heavy trauma-informed data screenings, that they're actually in some cases backfiring, unfortunately, because what ends up happening is that teachers can then develop kind of expectations about a student and then label them with you know, oh, this child has so many ACEs and this child has high or low in the number of ACEs, and then treat them differently based on that. And so that's not what we want, you know, in terms of the screenings. That's not what the intent of being trauma informed. And so I foresee potentially an open letter to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, you know, respectfully requesting a reconsideration of this in the current age that we're in of big data and predictive analytics. There are, again, health insurance companies that are going to be very, very interested in that data. There's a huge market for these data getting bought and sold. Marika, did you want to add?
I would leave you as with the information. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Roxana. And I accidentally started reading the next question, so I'm going to reread the next question that came in. We have a community-based organization seeking to rest in between the tech measurement and the school sites where we manage authentic relationships. Who can we partner with to strengthen our team and our data work?
Wow,
Can you
that's a
read that
good
one more
question.
time, please?
Yeah.
Sure. We have a community-based organization seeking to rest in between the tech measurement and school sites where we manage authentic relationships. Who can we partner with to strengthen our team and our data work?
Wow, I don't know a good answer to that of an entity that would bridge both the tech data and the relationships. Um, I would say lean towards the group that would be developing strong relationships and focus on that. I'm not, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Marika?
I'd say there is an opportunity and openings for more people to be able to fill that space. So don't have any easy answers for you now, but we are going to have to start building muscle around that on the ground and in our communities to be able to navigate that.
Sure, and we can connect Mark, who's asking those questions, to our presenters too, if there's any other offline follow-up that you'd
Perfect.
like to do. One other question that's come in, what are some things to look for as schools become community schools? Should we worry about data collection in these schools as they provide wraparound services?
It's a good question to be asking. I think that is a question that you should be asking the schools, because I don't think all of folks that are focusing on developing and building out community schools have really considered this about how the data will interact with all of those different services that are available and points of entry to access that information. I think beginning with ethical guidelines that have been provided would be a good place to start. And Dr. Marachi, if you have any suggestions, I'd be open to that as well.
I want to thank the person who sent in the question, because it is another area that I would have probably had been the third main, I talked about social emotional learning, trauma informed approaches, or ACEs, and the third thing that I would have mentioned if there had been more time would have been to pay attention to the community schools. Now, this is again challenging because there's the authentic, true community connected schools that are deeply embedded within our historical communities and bring the community to school. Yeah, I mean, there's the authentic version of it, and then there's this newer model of bringing in, again, innovative models and funding impact projects that could come in the form of these wraparound services. I would ask the questions about where the data are going, and if it's going to be these comprehensive integrated data systems. I would urge caution around it. It's complicated to just say, no, don't do community schools, because again, that language has already been embedded in our cultures of authentic good work with our communities. So I don't want to say don't do community schools. I just want to say be vigilant about the new initiatives that would come with the language of innovation and impact and smart contracts and those kinds of things that could try to datafy and socially control our communities and our youth in ways that would be harmful rather than helpful. Very complicated response, and I would just urge caution. I think again, one of the bloggers who's done a lot of work and has written critically about this is in Philadelphia. The name of her blog is wrenchinthegears.com.
And I would also like to, in response to many of the questions that even have popped up tonight, is to talk about what is that school sense of the budget that it would require in order to do that type of system successfully, and really have them give an explanation of the cost benefit and those other pieces. Because what we found in the Twin Cities and in St. Paul, when we asked questions about these platforms, is they couldn't give us a number. And that's one of the places that we're still trying to unpack and uncover. So the question would be, how much of this budget is going to be dedicated to protecting and storing and doing this data work? Because that can be a really contentious place in the conversation and can shut down the direction, because is this a reallocation of existing resources? Is this new money? And so I think it's a really good way to kind of root up where this is coming from and how it's supported, by saying, how can we afford this? And is this the best way that we can invest in supporting our children?
Mhm. Very
And
good comment.
thank you both for the responses. I'll share one other comment that came in, and I think you touched a little bit about on this, about how you've been doing it in your work, but if there's anything else you'd want to add, just sharing that it isn't enough to share this information, but it's imperative to get it into the hands of our youth and families and arm them to articulate what they see as inequities. So if there's anything else either of you want to add in that area.
So what I will say on our end is we have taken that as a very serious opportunity. And so we have been developing community summits. We've been developing community data camps. And so that we can actually translate what we've learned on behalf of community here and translate that in other places. So literally we are working on developing a toolkit for communities to really combat this in their local community. And I will also say that as a part of our program with our research project of doing the information gathering, one of the next stages that we'll be doing is convening people to talk about their individual experiences and asking folks to share their stories. And that means getting those stories out through the media. It means getting those stories out in blogs, podcasts, anywhere, so that, again, it's not an assumption that a particular type of people are going to be dealing with this technology thing. We really need to get ingrained that this is us, this is our data, and no data about us without us.
Great, thank you both. Those are the questions that have come in. Several people also did ask about how we're going to share the webinar and if we'll make the slides available. So there'll be both a video of the webinar today, but also we will make the slides and links and other information available. But that's it for the questions. So I will turn it back over to Tafari and our presenters.
I just
All
really
right.
want
Go
to
ahead, Marika. Yep.
quickly I just really want to quickly ask as a commitment. Well, first, I want to have the invitation for anyone who's a participant in this webinar to participate as a data gatherer in your local community. But the second piece is I really encourage you to go out and invite your elected officials, your city council members, your school board members, whoever it is, and sit down and have a conversation with them and see what they actually know about what's happening. Begin to ask them questions so that it really is planted on people's minds, and that whether it exists or not, the conversation is starting, so then we can really build from there and what needs to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. Sounds good indeed. And so thank you, Liz. Thank you, Marika. Thank you, Dr. Mashi, for all of your work. And Marika, I know you wanted to jump in, like we said at the top of this conversation, that this is just part one of this digital intensive. So there's a lot more to come, and stay tuned for that. And Marika, if you could say a little bit about just like when the next date is for that, and also then I'll jump back in and say some stuff about closing out and sharing out from here, and then we can land this plane and close out part one.
Great, thanks, Tafari. Okay, so our next digital intensive is on November 15th, and we'll be picking up the conversation based on what is the landscape and doing a deeper dive around the civil rights and protections of youth and family when it comes to our data, our big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms. So we invite you to be a part of that conversation. We'll be sending information out about the details, but mark your calendar for November 15th, because we're going to continue to have this conversation about no data about us without us.
Indeed. Thank you for that. And sharing out here too as well. Definitely want to encourage people, if you do want to share digitally, to use the hashtags data for public good and or algorithmic transparency. If you go to the DSC Twitter feed, you'll see those hashtags up. There were a few posts that I was able to capture from the discussion. So share out learning, share out ahas, share out things that terrified you that you heard, because it is definitely a behemoth of a infrastructure of things that we're working with. And as I've heard the refrain time and time again, we are all we got and we're all we need. And so thank y'all for your time and for your energy. And so stay tuned for November 15th. In the meantime, in between time, Chairman Fred Hampton said, peace if you're willing to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.